I, Nicoletta, a 29-year-old woman with a clear gaze and a strong character, one of those who are not afraid to call things by their proper names and are not inclined to obey unnecessarily, married last year to Alberto, a man 2 years older than me, balanced, reasonable, calm, always polite, as if specially checking every word before it leaves his lips. And it was for this reserved and gentle nature of his that I once fell in love with him, deciding that in our union my fiery, impulsive beginning would be balanced by his peaceful and almost philosophical equanimity. We dated for about 3 years, slowly getting closer, going through the usual tests of relationships, but without the storms and scenes typical of many other couples, where feelings flare up quickly and burn out like dry leaves in the sun. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. At first glance, everything was fine with us. We lived in a small but cozy apartment in the old quarter. On weekends we went for walks along the embankment, argued about books and films, went to the sea when we could afford it, and, despite rare disagreements, lived in relative harmony, until the pattern that was woven far beyond the microcosm of Alberto and me began to emerge. Because from the very first moment, as soon as I met his father, I felt as if I was being drawn into some kind of musty, oppressive atmosphere, where all words were spoken with an eye to effect, and looks were always filled with hidden meaning. This man, whom, perhaps, everyone in the city knew, the owner of a chain of hardware stores, a formidable patriarch with a hot temper and a shrill voice, was accustomed to the fact that everything always happens according to his will. He really did consider himself not just a shopkeeper, but a sort of local monarch, a ruler of fates, whose opinion was not to be questioned, and whose decisions were taken as law. In his presence, even the air seemed heavier, saturated with a mixture of ambition, self-satisfaction, and barely restrained contempt for anyone who dared to act independently. His wife, Bianca, was like a shadow, the quietest, most inconspicuous, as if fate itself had decided that her role was only to nod, smile, and be near, without interfering, without arguing, without expressing either joy or pain. The same, as it turned out, applied to his sons, including my husband, who from his youth, apparently, had become accustomed to an existence in conditions of constant approval and quiet submission, where the inner voice had long since died down, giving way to the intonations of his father. At first I tried to justify it with the peculiarities of family upbringing, cultural nuances, the legacy of traditions. After all, every family has its own eccentricities, its own deep-rooted customs. But real anxiety crept into my heart on our wedding day. That vineyard near San Marzano, where we decided to celebrate the celebration, was a modest but picturesque corner. Green vines gently twined around snow-white wooden pergolas, the wind carried the scent of rosemary and lavender, and at sunset the sky became so bright, as if time itself decided to bless us. My family flew in from another city, friends gathered, everything was going perfectly, until, in the midst of the reception, when the guests had just begun to immerse themselves in leisurely conversations and dishes filled with the aromas of southern cuisine, his father approached me with that cold, almost solemn expression on his face that sent a chill down my spine. "Nicoletta," he said, leaning slightly, as if inviting me to a secret conversation, "do you have a minute? We need to talk alone." I didn't expect anything bad. Maybe he'd wish me happiness, give me some good advice, or, in the worst case, say something along the lines of, "Take care of my son." But instead of words, he handed me a neatly folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, I saw a title that immediately made the blood drain from my face: "The Rules of Your Marriage." It sounded so absurd that the first thing that came to my mind was a joke. But his expression remained extremely serious, even with some kind of cold satisfaction in his eyes. The list began categorically: all important decisions must be approved by me, family holidays are held at my home, any plans related to purchases, cars, repairs, discuss with me in advance, raise children, strictly according to our traditions, in case of disagreement, listen to me. 11 points, each of which sounded not advice, not a request, but a sentence, an order, a final point. I looked up at him in confusion and, unable to find the words, only smiled weakly. I hoped that he would smile, wink, as if to say, "Don't take it seriously." But he only slightly raised the corners of his lips, said with emphasis, "You will understand. Everything will go more smoothly that way." And then, noticing that I still couldn't find anything to say, he added quietly, but with that icy tone that was impossible not to catch, Just keep the peace. Everyone is happier when I participate. Later, already in the room, I showed the sheet to Alberto. He glanced at it, nodded slightly, and said in an even indifferent voice, "Yes, just agree. It's easier that way." At that moment, it was as if someone had torn the blindfold off my eyes. Everything became crystal clear. My husband had never known a different order of things. He had grown up in a world where the words opinion and will were exclusively male prerogatives, but not his, but his father's. Where there were no dialogues, there were instructions. Where there was no choice, there was submission. But I was not part of that world. And I never intended to be. I didn't make a scene, didn't start an argument, just smiled as if nothing had happened, but the wheels were already turning in my mind. Back from my honeymoon, I made an appointment with a lawyer, a woman with sharp features and a keen gaze, specializing in cases where personal boundaries are blurred under the pressure of family authorities. I walked in with that same list, put it on the table. She glanced at it and immediately asked, "So, what do you think is the role of your father-in-law in this marriage?" "None," I answered. "Or, at least, there shouldn't be one." And we spent the next 2 hours laying everything out on the shelves, what he has the right to do and what he absolutely cannot, how to protect yourself without provoking an open conflict, what measures should be taken in advance to save the family, but not lose yourself. She explained that if he ever crossed that invisible but firm line between opinion and control, between good intentions and overbearing obsession, especially in matters concerning Alberto's and my property, our joint financial decisions, or, most delicately, the upbringing of future children, then I, as a full participant in this marriage, as a free adult woman, had every legal right to stop him without entering into open confrontation and without destroying the fragile family balance. "But," she said, leaning forward slightly and lowering her voice, as if she wanted to emphasize the personal nuance of her recommendation, "frankly, the most sensible thing is to let him know right away that you are not playing his game and will not be one of those who give in exchange for the illusion of peace." Together we drafted a document, not a threatening letter, not a legal declaration, but a polite, coolly polite notice, every word as carefully crafted as a line in a contract, not intended for the court but to, if necessary, clearly and formally delineate boundaries. It was simple, succinct, and crystal clear. "Thank you for your interest in our decisions regarding home and family. In future, please send any proposals through me and my husband jointly. All major decisions are made exclusively between the two of us, in a private setting. We will not seek outside approval. We hope for your understanding." Dry, neutral, but relentless. I put the document in a folder and left it in a drawer, waiting. I did not have to wait long. 2 months after talking with the lawyer, Alberto and I began discussing the possibility of buying our own home. It was a step we had been working towards for a long time, saving money, putting aside every spare euro, comparing mortgage offers, spending evenings studying catalogs, and going to open days every Sunday, with a hope, slightly hidden but growing stronger, that we would finally find the very place that could become our refuge. Guess who found out about it and invited us to discuss everything in more detail? His father, of course. The invitation was formal, but it had that very tone that I already knew by heart, insistently neutral, as if it were not a request but an obligation. When we arrived at his home, we were greeted by a perfectly set table, untouched coffee, and folders already laid out on the massive tabletop, neat, lined up, with labels, tables, charts, bank printouts, and even offers from realtors. He hadn't just prepared, he had put together a full-fledged presentation, as if we were going to negotiate with the board of directors. Alberto, nodding as usual, sat down and began leafing through the documents, as if it were something ordinary, like Sunday lunch or a family visit, and I silently took out my folder and handed my husband's father our document. He took it, unfolded it, read it. The silence thickened like milk in a cheese tub. He didn't smirk, didn't comment, didn't throw out an ironic phrase, as he had done before. He simply looked up and asked, "Is this necessary?" "Yes," I answered. "This." He didn't object. He didn't try to argue. He simply nodded silently, and we stood up. On the way home, Alberto said almost nothing. He sat in the car, staring out the window, as if he were seeing the world on the other side of the glass for the first time, as if he had only just realized that he didn't have to be afraid of it. And, to be honest, there was something relieved in his silence, as if someone had finally said out loud what he himself had never dared to formulate. Since then, it was as if an unknown tension had dissipated in the air, and although I had no illusions that everything would now be smooth, I knew that something had shifted. His father made no further attempts to interfere, at least everything looked calm. We found a cozy house, with 3 bedrooms, a high fence, a well-kept garden and a bright glassed-in veranda, where in the mornings it smelled of coffee and lavender, and in the evenings the sunsets were reflected in the glass, like a picture in a frame. Alberto seemed to come alive, became freer, more talkative, as if for the first time in his life he allowed himself not to look back, not to wait for approval. We furnished the house together, laughed at how we hung a shelf incorrectly, chose wallpaper, argued about the color of the tiles, but all of this was ours. And yet, despite the outward calm, I knew, a man like his father does not give up. He retreats into the shadows, bides his time, tries new moves. And I was right. At first, these were just small comments, said in passing during Sunday dinners, where we still tried to go, for the sake of family, for the sake of fragile peace. Interesting neighborhood you chose. I hope they check the pipes, the houses there are old, known for their problems. Or, let me know when you start renovating. I have a contractor, an honest guy, I would not sign anything without his approval. I ignored it, pretending not to hear, not to notice, hoping that if I didn't add fuel to the fire, it would burn out on its own. But that wasn't the case. About 6 months after our move, Rachel, Alberto's younger brother's wife, gave birth to her first child. The family's joy was great, and it would seem that the father-in-law should now have a new field for self-realization. And so it happened, but not in the form that one would wish for a young mother. He pressed his entire heavy shadow against the baby, starting with harmless toys and blankets, and then moved on to daily visits, endless advice, instructions, comments, and, finally, complete control over the child's daily routine. How to feed, how to dress, what time to put to bed. And all this with such conviction, as if he himself had just graduated from medical school with honors, and certainly knew better than anyone how to raise children. It was exhausting to watch. And then one evening, when the house smelled of roasted tomatoes with garlic, and we were gathered for our usual Sunday dinner in his parents' dining room, amidst innocent conversations about the weather, traffic jams, and the price of olive oil, he suddenly turned to me, his hands folded across his stomach, and with the same expression people use when announcing a decision that has long been made for you, he said, "When you two have kids, we'll do it properly. I'll help you work out a schedule. We can use a family doctor. I'll look for a daycare. I already have ideas." I looked at him without blinking, as if trying to figure out if this man really believed he was part of a process that hadn't even begun yet, as if he expected me to nod, burst into tears of gratitude, and exclaim, "Thank you, how good it is that you've already decided everything for me." And my husband was silent, not saying a word, staring at his plate as if he were intently studying the texture of the mashed potatoes, and I felt a wave of heat rise inside me, not anger, no, but that quiet, agonizing despair when you realize you're standing alone in front of an entire system. And yet I forced myself to smile, and, picking up my fork a little more confidently than I needed to, I said, "Well, we're a long way from that." He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, with that look that only people who were sure of their own infallibility had, and grinned, "You'll thank me. I know how to do it." That evening, when we were driving home in silence, and I could hear Alberto's anxious breathing beating in his chest, I said bluntly, without beating around the bush, "I won't do it. I'm not going to put our children in a situation where your father thinks he's the third parent." And Alberto, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, simply sighed and said quietly, "I know. I don't know how to stop him. This is who he is." That night, I barely slept a wink, not because I was furious, but because for the first time I truly understood that he wasn't just tolerating his father. He had grown up in an environment where refusal was considered betrayal, where silence was the only form of protection. And then came the moment that was the real turning point, not a big one, not a dramatic one, but one that changed everything. One afternoon, midweek, while I was minding my own business, Alberto received an email from his father. He showed it to me straight away, without comment, as if he wanted me to see for myself that it wasn't the fruit of my suspicions. The message was written politely, almost affectionately, an offer to help with the mortgage. And at first it sounded reasonable, almost generous. But when we read it more closely, the meaning became clear. "I am willing to pay off part of your loan," he wrote. "In exchange, I would like my name on the document, purely for the safety of the family, of course. Nothing will change on your part, but if something happens, I can intervene and make sure the house remains in the family. Let me know." My heart sank, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this man was not retreating, not giving in, but only looking for new paths, more subtle, more dangerous. He wasn't just offering help, he was offering control, wrapped in care. He wanted to legally insert himself into our home, into our routine, into our independence, as if we were his project, temporarily farmed out. And what was truly scary was that my husband was thinking about it. "Maybe I should think about it," he said that night as we ate dinner in silence, and there was weariness in his voice, hope, as if he were looking for a way out. "It would take a lot of the pressure off, reduce the debt," he added, and then I realized, his father wasn't holding him by a rope, but by a thin thread of guilt, debt, and habit. He couldn't even recognize the manipulation when it was happening before his eyes. "Absolutely not," I said sharply, clearly, without raising my voice, but with the confidence I would have had in front of a jury. "I don't care if we pay off this house until we're old." He would not put his name on anything we owned. It was the start of the loudest fight we had ever had. We shouted over each other, I cried, he was silent, then he argued again, then he sat in the corner, staring at the floor. He was torn, between me and the man who had kept him in a mental cage for years, between love and loyalty, between the present and the past that would not let go. And finally, when I broke down and said, "Look, I love you, but I am not going to live under your father's thumb. I will not do it. And I will not be afraid to take steps if I have to," he looked at me as if for the first time, and was silent for a long time. The next day we wrote him back. Politely, but without options. "Thank you for the offer, but we are not interested. Our home is our own." Simple, final. But I felt the damage was done. From that moment on, he no longer looked at me as his son's wife. Now he saw me as a threat, a hindrance, someone who was leading my son astray, someone who was undermining the established tradition. And that was the beginning of a new game. About a week later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number while driving home from work. I picked it up without thinking. I had work calls, clients. But it was him. "I think we should meet," he said evenly. "Just the two of us. Talk woman to man. Clear the air." Something in his tone made me cringe, but I agreed anyway. I wanted to hear what he had to say, see how far he was willing to go. We met at an old diner, halfway between our house and his. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting in a corner booth, drinking black coffee, looking like he was about to bark orders. I sat down across from him and didn't waste time on polite greetings. He leaned forward, looking me in the eye, and said, "Look, I don't know what you're doing, but this family has a way of doing things. Always has. You can fight it all you want, but eventually you'll see. It's better to have me on your side. Otherwise, things will get bad." I didn't look away, I didn't soften, I didn't try to compromise. I simply asked, "Bad for whom?" He smiled, but there was no warmth or humor in it. I finished my water, stood up, looked at him, and said, "Thank you for talking with us." On the way home, looking at the evening lights blurred on the windshield, and feeling a strange calm pulsing in my chest instead of fear, I suddenly understood something simple, yet decisive. This man was not simply trying to control us, not simply imposing his will under the guise of family care. He considered us his property, part of some kind of system he had created, in which everyone obeyed and everything revolved around him, like planets around a self-proclaimed sun, and he was not going to stop until either we broke, did not bend to his standards, or did not push him away so decisively, so irrevocably, that he would finally understand this game was over for him. So I immediately called my lawyer again, and this time not for a consultation, not for a gentle notice, but to begin drawing up a legal document that would not be just a symbolic gesture, but a real shield, the blow of which cannot be ignored. I thought that encounter at the diner, with its innuendos and smiles and subtle threats, was his climax, his final card up his sleeve, his big move. But I was wrong. It was just a prelude, a first call, a test shot. The real attack came a month later, on a Saturday morning, when I was pulling weeds in the backyard, wearing an old shirt, knees in the grass, feeling the sun on my neck, the cool earth tingling in my hands. Alberto came outside, pale, his eyes far away, a shadow of himself. I knew immediately that something had happened. He silently handed me his phone, and I wiped my palms on my pants and took it. On the screen was a group message from my father, to him, his brothers, their mother, and me. I have a family meeting at my house tonight. This is non-negotiable. The agenda includes future family plans, vacation arrangements, financial security, and expectations. Attendance is mandatory. I read it over and over again, as if each new reading might change the meaning of the words. What the hell is that? I asked. Alberto shrugged, looking down. I've never seen him do anything like this. And then the truth hit me. He was no longer trying to operate quietly, no longer limiting himself to behind-the-scenes conversations. Now he was gathering everyone, his sons, his wife, me, because he needed an audience. He needed a space where he could publicly show who the real leader was in this family. He was going to put me in my place in front of everyone, and perhaps he was counting on the crowd effect to break me. I almost refused to go. My body protested. My mind urged me to stay home, not play by his rules, but something in me told me I had to go. I had to see what he had done with his power. Everyone was already there when we arrived. His father sat at the head of the table, a pile of papers casually spread out in front of him, like the chairman of a corporate board. He didn't stand or say hello, he just started talking. There's been some confusion about how things should be done in our family, he said, without looking up. So I've prepared guidelines so that everyone has a common understanding. He handed each of us a printed document. I took it mechanically. There were pages of text, worded with maniacal precision, that spelled out everything from the fact that decisions regarding real estate and property should be discussed as a family and approved by the group unless overruled by him personally, to the affirmation of child-rearing practices, in the interests of preserving family values. Holidays alternated, but they could be overruled by him. Financial aid comes with the right of supervision. Each page is a new level of absurdity, disguised as care. I looked up. His wife, Bianca, had her head down, studying her lap, as if they could save her from what was happening. His sons were simply reading, emotionless, unresponsive, as if they had been handed a menu. And then, without raising my voice, but clearly, so that no one could fail to hear, I said, "It will not happen." He didn't even flinch. He just grimaced slightly, as if he'd heard a petulant no from a child. "I'm just keeping order," he said. "No one else is complaining." I looked at Alberto. This was the decisive moment, the moment of choice, the moment of truth. And I saw him just sitting. Silent. Without a word. Without a movement. I felt a cold, burning wave of disappointment, as if my heart had fallen somewhere into emptiness. But I didn't let myself break down. I folded the papers, placed them carefully on the table, stood up, looked at everyone and said, "Thank you for dinner." Then I turned and left, alone. I didn't go home that night. I stayed with a friend. I needed space, not so much physical as internal. And the next morning, at first light, I called the lawyer again. This time we didn't just write a letter. We began a full-scale process of legally blocking his interference, preparing cease and desist notices regarding our finances, property, and personal decisions, updating property deeds, wills, medical orders, and even incapacitation orders, adding clear clauses to each document that excluded his involvement or interference. We blocked everything. But that wasn't the point. While my lawyer and I were busy doing what seemed like the last and surest way to once and for all block this man's interference, immersed in updating property deeds, wills, covenants, and other legal layers that would finally seal our boundaries, she suddenly paused, frowned, and said, Now that's interesting. I knew right away that nothing good could begin with that tone. It turns out that when we were just starting the house buying process, and early on, almost casually, my husband's father said to us with a good-natured grin, "Look, I have this mortgage broker. He's been with us for about 15 years. He's a reliable guy. He always does everything right." It turns out there was more to that reliability. Guess what? This reliable guy sent my father-in-law regular updates on our payments, the status of the escrow account, tax assessments, even what additional applications we had filed, for 6 months after the deal closed. It wasn't outright illegal, none of it violated bank secrecy in the sense that he could be immediately jailed, but it was outrageous, disgusting, and violated the most important thing, trust and the basic right to privacy. We found copies of messages, letters, emails where this broker was not just passing on reports, but CCing my father-in-law, in at least 4 separate chains. I wasn't just angry, I felt my insides turn cold. I no longer suspected, I had proof. And my lawyer, barely finishing reading, almost beamed. "If you really want to get into nuclear power," she said, adjusting her glasses, "then we have a basis for it. A formal complaint, and possibly a lawsuit." But before we could work out the next step, before I had drafted a legal letter and handed it to the bank, he did what I had intuitively expected from the first days. He tried to seize the initiative again, portraying everything as a peaceful, family reconciliation. For no reason at all, no context, he suddenly invited us to dinner, to one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city center, just the 3 of us, him, my husband and me. Alberto seemed almost agitated. He was pleading, begging. He said he wanted to apologize, just to talk. Maybe he finally realized he overdid it. "Let's go, please." And although I didn't believe him for a second, I was curious. I wanted to see how deep his game went, and how confident he was that he was untouchable. We arrived. Everything was perfect. Waiters with perfect smiles, linen napkins, impeccable meat, conversation smooth, almost easy. He was polite, even warm, telling stories about how he sold his first set of screwdrivers as a teenager, how he met Bianca, how happy he was that we were a family. I had almost allowed myself to relax when, after dessert, he carefully took a folder out of his briefcase, took out some papers and, as if nothing had happened, handed them to me across the table. "Just look," he said. "No pressure. It's just an offer." I glanced at the document. And I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a contract. A formal agreement, drawn up with the help of a lawyer, which gave him a share of our property, joint ownership of the house, in exchange for tax breaks, cost-cutting, and long-term family security. I literally heard something heavy slam in my head. I pushed the folder back across the table. "No," I said. Simple and clear. Alberto looked as if he wanted to disappear, evaporate, or sink into the floor. And his father, without blinking, shrugged and said, "It's not personal. It's just business." And in that moment, sitting in a fancy restaurant, with cold wine, overlooking the evening streets, I understood, he would never stop. Never. Not willingly. Not out of decency. He would only stop when he was stopped. After that dinner, when we went outside, I felt like we had almost no time left. This was no longer about peace, about balance, about family politeness. This was a game of chess, and he moved the pieces with the full knowledge that we were just pawns on his board. And my husband? He still didn't get up. He was still looking for explanations, saying, "That's just how he is, let's not complicate things, don't bring it to war." But the war had already happened. After the wedding, everything became so obvious, so blatant, and I got tired of pretending that nothing was happening. I decided that I had had enough. I made a plan. I called my lawyer. We agreed, we didn't just need to defend ourselves, we needed to put an end to it. A final one. Not emotional, not noisy, legal, documentary, cold and strong. I told my husband, "We're having a family dinner at our house. Neutral territory. Invite everyone. Brothers. Mom. Him. Everyone who allowed this to happen silently." He was nervous, but he agreed. And then the evening came. I set the table as if for a holiday. I made sure the house was spotlessly clean. I cooked a big dinner, with wine, with snacks, lit candles, turned on music. There was a folder on the sideboard. Everything was ready. They arrived on time, as if on command. His mother, as always, was silent. His brothers chatted among themselves. And his father, he walked in triumphantly, laughing, telling stories, pouring himself a bourbon, and acting as if he had already won. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. The air was tense, as if someone in the room was holding a grenade, and everyone was waiting to see who would pull the pin. Then, when dinner was almost over, and I was silently gathering the plates from the sides of the table, carrying them one by one into the kitchen, without saying a word, feeling how every minute brought closer the moment I had been preparing with such inner tension, I finally went to the sideboard, opened its door, took out a carefully prepared folder of documents and placed it on the table, casually, but with all determination, exactly in front of the one who was the source of this whole long chain of conflicts, complaints, and heavy silences. Before dessert, before the fruit and coffee had arrived, I finally spoke, looking him straight in the eye, without a hint of hesitation in my voice, firmly. We're going to clear something up. He looked first at the folder, then at me, his eyebrows raised slightly, without losing his usual haughty expression, as if he were trying to decide whether to take this seriously at all. "What is it?" he asked, still with a hint of dismissive politeness. "Proof," I said. "Of everything you did. The mortgage broker, the emails, the breaches of confidentiality, the contracts, the imposed rules, the hidden manipulations. Everything." There was a silence around the table, thick, sticky, almost tangible. Bianca, his wife, was huddled in her chair as if she wanted to disappear into its upholstery. His brother suddenly found the ceiling extremely interesting, staring at it with intense concentration, as if he expected a revelation there. And my husband? He just looked at his hands, as if he was noticing the lines on his palms for the first time. I continued, slowly, not letting my emotions get the better of me, but with such an inner strength that the pressure in the room seemed to shift. "You have been running this family for decades. You make decisions like they are your birthright. But that ends today. You are no longer part of our decisions. You are not part of our finances. You will not be part of our future children's lives unless you are invited. You have no right to interfere with any part of our marriage, our home, or our plans. And if you try, I will sue. I have all the paperwork ready to do so. Signed, certified, with copies, and you know it." I saw his face, a moment ago an angry crimson, turn pale, almost gray, and how he looked down for a moment, as if a crack had appeared in his armor. But of course he tried to pull himself together, to get back into character, to find the same arrogant mask that always saved him in awkward conversations. He laughed, not sincerely, not heartily, but harshly, coldly. "Oh, come on. You're exaggerating. It's just a family matter." I was helping. But then something happened that, to be honest, I almost didn't expect. My husband finally spoke. His voice was quiet, even, but in that silence there was a new power, something that hadn't been there before. "No, you didn't help," he said, without looking up. "You've controlled me my whole life. Her mother, my brothers, we all just let you do it. But we're done." You could hear a pin drop in a corner, it was so quiet. His father looked at him with an expression that was impossible to read, as if he didn't believe that he was telling the truth. "Are you serious?" he asked. "I'm dead serious," Alberto replied, pushing the folder towards him. "Take it. Read it if you want. Or throw it away. But it's over. You don't rule us anymore." And then something happened that was most unexpected. His mother, Bianca, suddenly burst into tears. Not quietly, not subduedly, but truly, like someone who had kept everything inside for too long. Years of silence, compromise, fear of her husband's anger, endless concessions, all of it collapsed in an instant. "Do you know what it's like to live with this for so many years?" she said through her tears. "I don't even know who I am anymore." His brothers, who had barely spoken all evening, sat in silence, then one of them nodded, slowly, as if acknowledging something inside himself. "I always thought that's how families work," he said. "Now I see that it's not." It was not like that. Meanwhile, his father sat in silence. Without a remark. Without sarcasm. No smirk. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked more than just hurt, he looked alone. Small. Unwanted. He stood up without waiting for dessert, picked up the folder his son had returned to him, and left without a word. There was a silence in the room so thick you could cut it with a knife. The door slammed shut, and no one moved. We sat in silence. No one knew what to do. Everything seemed to have stopped. My husband looked at me, his eyes wet but clear. "I should have said this years ago," he whispered. I nodded. "Yes. But you did it now." His mother stayed behind, helping us clean up, slowly, silently, and I noticed her glance at the door every now and then, as if she expected him to come back, to come in, to tell us it had all been a mistake. But he didn't. At least not that night. The next week was strange. No calls, no messages, no letters. He was gone. As if he had fallen out of the reality in which we had grown accustomed to his constant presence. Alberto seemed lighter, freer, but at the same time there was a sadness in him that had not been there before. He was finally realizing how many years of his life he had spent trying to be both a good son and a good husband, a task in which sooner or later one part would fail. I felt drained, exhausted, as if I had been through a hurricane, but at the same time I felt something akin to relief. Not just for myself, but for the whole family. Because, to be honest, this was never just me. This was about a man who had built his entire identity on control. And about what happens when those you control suddenly wake up. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. An email. Short. "I've read everything. I know where this is going. I'll keep my distance for now. No apologies. No confessions." But this, frankly, was probably the closest he'd ever come to reconciliation. And that was enough. Because now the difference was clear, this time it wasn't up to him. We had the power. And we weren't going to give it up. Leave a comment on what you thought of this story, and don't forget to subscribe and like it. See you soon.